You may think you are helping your tomatoes when you remove every sucker you can find, but that habit is probably the reason your plants never give you the harvest you expected. I made that same mistake for years because everyone kept saying that all suckers steal food from the plant and must be removed as soon as they appear. Every summer, I worked hard and believed I was doing everything right, but when harvest time came, I always wondered why my neighbors carried home buckets of tomatoes while my plants looked clean, but not very productive. Then, one older gardener showed me something so simple that I still use it today, and ever since then my tomatoes have rewarded me with a much heavier crop without spending extra money or buying special products. I want to share that experience with you because many people over 50 have been growing tomatoes for years and still repeat the same mistake without even realizing it. The truth is that not every sucker should disappear. There is one particular sucker that can become your helper instead of your enemy, if you know when to leave it alone. Most people never pay attention to this because they rush through the garden and remove everything that looks unnecessary. That is exactly where the harvest begins to shrink. I learned many years ago that the plant always gives small clues if you slow down and look carefully. Tomatoes are much smarter than we often think, and they react to every cut we make. When we remove the wrong shoot, the plant has to waste strength recovering instead of building fruit. That old gardener smiled at me and said that many people work harder than necessary because they are fighting the plant instead of helping it. Those words stayed with me. Since then, I stopped treating every sucker as a problem and started watching how each plant develops before making a decision. In the next part, I will tell you which sucker most people remove by habit and why that single mistake can quietly reduce the number of tomatoes long before the first fruits even begin to grow. I noticed something after I stopped removing every sucker without thinking. The strongest plants always behaved a little differently, and at first I could not understand why. One morning, I walked through the garden before the sun became too hot, and I looked at every tomato bush one by one instead of rushing to finish the job. That was when I saw the pattern that I had ignored for many years. The sucker growing just below the first flower cluster often looked healthy and strong. My old neighbor told me never to cut that one too quickly because it could become the best insurance for the whole plant. At first, I did not believe him because I had heard the opposite from many people. Still, I decided to leave that single sucker on several plants while removing the others as I usually did. I wanted to compare the results with my own eyes because experience always teaches better than arguments. After a few weeks, the difference became easier to notice. Those plants looked more balanced and they did not seem to struggle after hot days or cool nights. They kept growing steadily and later they carried more flower clusters than I expected. I'm not saying that every tomato should grow into a thick jungle because that creates other problems. The point is that one carefully chosen sucker can help the plant instead of hurting it. Most people make the mistake right here because they think faster work always means better work. They see a new shoot and remove it immediately without asking whether that shoot has an important purpose. Many years ago, an experienced gardener told me that tomatoes reward patience much more than speed, and I have found those words to be true every season. Another small secret is never to remove suckers when the plant is wet after rain or heavy morning dew. I always wait until the stems are dry because the cuts heal better and the plant continues growing without unnecessary stress. It costs nothing and takes only a little patience, but it can save many plants during the season. Very few people still follow this old habit, although it has been passed from gardener to gardener for decades. In the next part, I will explain exactly how I decide whether that important sucker should remain for the entire season, or whether there comes a moment when removing it actually becomes the better choice. There is another detail that changed the way I grow tomatoes, and I almost overlooked it because it seemed too simple to matter. When that important sucker below the first flower cluster begins to grow, I never let it develop without watching it closely. I give the plant a few more days, and then I look at the leaves and the flowers instead of measuring the height. If the main stem is growing well and the flower clusters look healthy, I know the plant has enough strength to support that extra shoot. If the weather suddenly becomes very hot, or a long period of rain slows everything down, that same sucker often helps the plant recover much faster than one with every side shoot removed. Many people are surprised when they hear this because they have always believed that fewer stems automatically mean more tomatoes. My experience has shown that the answer is not always so simple. Every season is different, and every garden teaches something new if we are willing to pay attention. One forgotten method that an older gardener shared with me many years ago was never to make all the pruning decisions on the same day. He walked through his tomato rows every 2 or 3 days and looked carefully before touching a single stem. At first, I thought that was too slow, but later I understood why he worked that way. A plant can change noticeably in only a few days, and the shoot that looked unnecessary at the beginning of the week may become the one that carries another strong cluster of fruit. That habit has saved me from making many mistakes. Another thing that most people do not notice is how the leaves protect developing tomatoes from strong afternoon sun. If too many stems disappear too early, the fruit can become exposed, and the plant spends extra energy dealing with heat instead of producing more tomatoes. I have seen this happen more than once, and after that I became much more careful with every cut. None of this costs money, and none of it requires expensive fertilizers or special equipment. It simply takes a little observation and patience. Most gardeners already have everything they need to do it successfully. But there is still one important step that I never skip because it decides whether that carefully chosen sucker really increases the harvest or quietly turns into a problem later in the season. That is exactly what I want to explain next. Now comes the part that many gardeners never think about, and this is exactly where that useful sucker can either become your best helper or start taking too much strength from the plant. I never leave it alone for the entire season without checking how it develops. Every few days I walk through my tomato rows with a cup of tea in my hand and simply look at the plants before touching anything. That quiet habit has saved me from many mistakes. If that second stem begins to grow evenly and forms healthy flower clusters, I leave it in place because it is already proving its value. If I notice that the plant is becoming too crowded with leaves and the air cannot move freely between the stems, I remove only the weakest new shoots while keeping the strongest ones. That way, the plant stays open enough for sunlight and fresh air, but still has enough green growth to feed the tomatoes. Most people make the mistake of removing too much all at once because they want the work finished quickly. I learned many years ago that tomatoes do not reward hurry. They reward careful attention. Another old method that was shown to me many years ago is to prune only a few plants at a time instead of the whole garden in one afternoon. After working on several bushes, I stop and continue another day. This keeps me from making the same mistake across every plant if I happen to judge something incorrectly. It also gives me time to notice how the tomatoes respond before I continue. Very few people still use this simple approach because everyone wants fast results, but I have found it far more reliable over the years. There's another small detail that costs absolutely nothing. After removing any unwanted shoot, I avoid watering the leaves that same day if possible. I water the soil instead and let the cut dry naturally. The plants seem to recover more comfortably, and I rarely see problems where the stem was removed. It is such a simple habit that many people ignore it, but sometimes the smallest changes bring the biggest difference by the end of the season. I still smile when I remember how convinced I was that every sucker had to disappear, because now I know that one careful decision can be worth far more than 20 quick cuts. But there is one more forgotten trick that made the biggest difference in the size and number of my tomatoes, and that is the method I never skip before the first fruits begin to grow. The moment the first small tomatoes begin to appear is when I become even more careful, because this is the stage where many gardeners unknowingly reduce their future harvest. I used to think that once the flowers turned into tiny fruits, the hard work was finished, but that is not how tomatoes behave. They continue watching how much strength they have, and they react to every change we make. This is why I never rush to remove the second stem that has already proven itself. Instead, I watch whether it is forming healthy flower clusters and whether the leaves remain a deep green color. If everything looks balanced, I let nature continue its work. Many people are surprised that doing less at the right moment often produces better results than doing more. An elderly gardener explained this to me many years ago by saying that a tomato plant does not like sudden changes. It prefers steady care and small adjustments. Those simple words stayed with me because every season I see how true they are. There is another forgotten habit that almost nobody talks about today. I gently remove only the oldest leaves that touch the ground while leaving the healthy upper leaves in place. This improves air movement near the soil, but still gives the fruit enough protection from strong sunlight. It takes only a few minutes and costs absolutely nothing, yet the plants often stay healthier throughout the season. Another mistake happens when people continue removing every new sucker until late summer. By that time, the plant has already decided how it wants to grow, and cutting too much can slow the final wave of fruit. I always look at the weather and the condition of the plant before making another cut. Every tomato bush is a little different, and that is why I never follow one strict rule for every row. Observation is worth much more than habit. I have learned that the garden rewards people who pay attention instead of those who simply repeat what they heard years ago. This careful approach has given me fuller branches and more ripe tomatoes without spending extra money on special products or complicated methods. But there is still one final lesson that brought everything together for me because it showed me when to stop interfering completely and simply let the plant finish its work. That last decision often makes the biggest difference between an average harvest and one that fills basket after basket. There comes a moment every season when I simply stop trying to improve the tomato plant because I have learned that too much care can become another kind of mistake. Many years ago, I believed there was always one more leaf to remove, or one more sucker to cut, but experience showed me that plants also need peace to finish their work. When the bushes are carrying several healthy clusters of tomatoes, and the important second stem is doing its job, I mostly leave the plants alone except for watering and checking their condition. This is often difficult because we want to help, but sometimes helping means not interfering. Very few people talk about this because it sounds too simple, but I have seen the difference with my own eyes more times than I can count. Another old gardener once told me that tomatoes grow best when the gardener learns to watch more than to touch. At the time, I smiled because it sounded like one of those sayings older people enjoy repeating. Years later, I understood exactly what he meant. Every unnecessary cut asks the plant to spend energy healing instead of filling fruit. Every unnecessary change forces it to adapt again. That is why I now make only careful decisions and then allow nature to continue. There is another small habit that costs nothing and has served me well for many seasons. I walk through the garden early in the morning or late in the evening when the light is softer and the plants are easier to examine. During those quiet walks, I often notice small changes that I would completely miss in the middle of a busy afternoon. Sometimes I find a damaged leaf that should be removed, or a branch that needs gentle support before it bends under the weight of growing tomatoes. These small actions take only a few minutes, but they prevent much bigger problems later. Most people think a large harvest comes from hard work alone, but I believe it comes from steady attention and simple habits repeated throughout the season. The forgotten secret has never been expensive fertilizer or complicated techniques. It has been knowing which sucker deserves to stay and knowing when the plant no longer needs your scissors. In the final part, I will bring all these simple lessons together and explain the easy routine that I now follow every season to enjoy healthy plants and baskets full of ripe tomatoes without making the mistakes that once cost me so much of my harvest. When I look back at all the years I spent growing tomatoes, I realize that my biggest improvements did not come from buying something new. They came from stopping a few old mistakes that almost everyone around me was making. The most important lesson was learning that not every sucker is an enemy. The strong sucker growing below the first flower cluster can become a valuable second stem if the plant is healthy and has enough strength to support it. Instead of cutting everything in a hurry, I now take a few quiet minutes to watch each plant before making a decision. That simple habit has given me fuller bushes, more flower clusters, and noticeably more ripe tomatoes by the end of the season. I also remember the old advice that was shared with me many years ago. Never rush through the garden, because the plants will always tell you what they need if you learn to look carefully. Those words have helped me far more than any expensive fertilizer or fashionable gardening trick. I remove only the shoots that truly make the plant too crowded. I leave enough healthy leaves to protect the fruit from strong sunlight. I avoid making unnecessary cuts when the stems are wet. Most importantly, I stop trying to control every little detail once the plants are growing well. That steady and simple routine costs nothing but a little time and attention, yet the reward can be seen in every basket you carry home. I hope this experience helps you avoid the same mistakes that I made for so many seasons, because gardening should bring satisfaction instead of disappointment. You do not need complicated methods to enjoy a generous harvest. Sometimes the forgotten ideas passed from one gardener to another are still the ones that work best today. If you try leaving that important sucker on a few healthy tomato plants this season, you can compare the results with your own eyes. I believe that is the best way to learn because every garden has its own character. Next time, I will share another old method that many people have forgotten. It is just as simple, and it can help your tomatoes stay healthy and productive until the very end of the season.